Thank you all for joining me today. I wanted to say that despite the seriousness with which I have posed in my headshot, all that I have to share today are some haphazard thoughts regarding the use of pictures as strategies for reading and writing philosophy. And then I will also be reading what I have written on reading and writing philosophy because, unlike Seth, I don't think I could do a good job of it not sounding like complete nonsense if I just did it off the cuff. That these strategies show up in the books, philosophical investigations, and Beyond Good and Evil are not so much important to me as the fact that they have been accepted, and in being accepted, perhaps overlooked, as legitimate methods of thinking, reading, and writing. I say all of this to claim that my observations, while maybe insightful, as the poster has either advised or promised, and based around the careful reading of these books, may be found to be disconnected between themselves and without an overarching concrete thesis and arche, telos, compared to, for instance, Seth's great presentation of philosophy of film. I also use this disclaimer as a means of answering, about one semester later, to a disagreement that I received in my last conference presenting on a similar enough reading of Wittgenstein. That Wittgenstein abandons the use of pictures as a reliable philosophical method in the investigations at the beginning of the second part with the duck rabbit example. That was the criticism. That was given by a doctoral student in Zagreb, where I presented. And he was very upset that I would imply that Wittgenstein doesn't abandon the use of pictures. This student might be correct that pictures are not reliable methods of stating or affirming scenarios, and he might even be correct that Wittgenstein himself believed that pictures are not reliable methods of stating or affirming scenarios, of pushing a thesis, of declaring what is, of stating the facts as they are, of getting it right, and so on. However, it is also an undeniable fact that Wittgenstein, and Nietzsche for that matter, opens the investigations and Beyond Good and Evil in consideration of a picture, and proceeds to pose several follow-up ones as a form of thinking through problems. It is also an undeniable fact that the most shocking and difficult things to process in our lifetime are often not carefully worded statements, but rather pictures that are just explicit enough to make part of its viewers go insane, or part of its viewers deny its status as a picture. We might think, for instance, of a white supremacist doing a Nazi salute in the inauguration of a president as a form of picture that says a lot without saying much. Yet we could also pretend that such a picture is not a picture at all. It is simply a passing by, a sentence, a gesture, such as throwing your heart out to the crowd, or a non-issue. Hence why I would like to discuss pictures and believe that learning how to read them is an important enough philosophical issue. That out of the way, or maybe with that in the way, but marching forward regardless, I wanted to briefly point out my choice for a picture in the poster. A picture of pictures, if you will. The Arnolfini portrait was painted in the 15th century by an artist named Jan van Eyck. It is a very popular painting for a number of reasons, including but not limited to the necessary technological development required to produce such a piece. Of note is not only the fact that the method of painting had changed from medieval times. I believe that Arnolfini portrait involves wet style of painting, which wasn't a thing before Van Eyck started doing it, and the geometrical understanding required to both paint the picture from a given perspective and replicate the perspective in the very small mirror at the back wall. If you paid attention to the painting, or if you ever had a class about the painting, you surely noticed that there is a mirror on the back wall which has an actual reflection of the painting, but it includes very strange details, such as, for example, we don't know where the painter is, what the perspective is meant to show, etc., etc., etc. Van Eyck was most importantly one of the first artists to sign their paintings, as before him the painting was generally seen as an act of God's will that is merely propagated by a subject of no importance, or at least not important enough to actually have a signature. Above the portrait, one can see by portrait I mean above the actual mirror and within the portrait, one can see the words Johannes van Eyck, Fut Hic 1434, which roughly translate to Jan van Eyck was here in 1434. This signature is a deviation from one that Van Eyck also commonly used, and one that became his motto, the signature Alles ich kann, which was often written in Greek letters, but translated to German or Dutch for Van Eyck at that point in time, as I can, as I myself, but also as I Van Eyck can. So it's a pun. As only Van Eyck could would also maybe work. The translation is not only a pun on Eyck's name, but it is also a reference to a common signature of the medieval period, as best I could or only as I could, which is meant to reference the artist's humility regarding the painting. One only does what one can, and what one does always falls short of the perfect divine act of creation. Some translations, for that very reason, give alles ich kann as well as I could. But the German is clear enough that it's meant to be, or Dutch, at Van Eyck's time period, it's clear enough that it is meant to be as I can in the present tense. This indicates to me a somewhat tongue-in-cheek declamation of the capacity of the artist to be the only one to be able to produce that particular piece. It is a signature meant to enforce Van Eyck's presence in his absence as a connection between his work and himself due to the technical and technological knowledge required to be able to produce such a piece. This signature is, furthermore, inscribed in the matter of the painting, which is to say in the physicality of the painting, in the painting proper, not on the frame or in a book in reference to the painting, but on the actual material of the painting. It is part of the painting, from which we can conclude that the painting could not have been created, it could not have its being without the presence of a painter capable of bringing it forth. While Van Eyck was one of the first painters to do so, it retroactively forces one to examine what were the signatures of every other painting up until that point, in which case there were no signatures, or at least if there were, they were very, very few. The signature is of course related to the matter, and that is the problem, the difficulty, of the recognition and compensation within the arts. We can understand Van Eyck's signature to be marking the particular presence, that of the author, that has been created, become of importance due to the technical and technological progression that has occurred. And this development forces us to reconsider the matter, which is the event, the question, the subject, of how we understand the production of artworks and the economy of art as a whole. Then we are able to see the distinction of the general and specific question of pictures. The general being how a signature, a marked presence, impacts every other production of paintings, and the specific being how the signature impacts the production of that one single particular painting. Well, what does this have to do with Wittgenstein in particular? Wittgenstein opens the investigations with a citation of Johann Nepomuk Nestroy. The trouble about progress is that it always looks much greater than it really is. This is his epigraph. While there is more than one way of grasping this passage, I would argue that at least part of the program of the investigations is questioning how far philosophy as a whole, but particularly philosophy of language, has really progressed across history. I would also argue that considering Wittgenstein will take up a particular picture as the beginning of the PI versus the generalized uniform picture of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein is questioning how much the Tractatus itself and the PI have really progressed philosophy, or have really progressed one from another. Of course, if Wittgenstein will use the philosophical pictures as the matter, as substance or evidence, for what the investigations will be conducted on, and if he is to rescind or question the progress that has been made in the Tractatus, he cannot push forward for a generalized theory of pictures as truth. Wittgenstein cannot erect a picture as a dismantling of pictures. The resource left for him is to discuss a specific picture of a specific painting that has its own signature, this being Augustine's picture of language. As a reminder, Augustine's picture is given in Latin from his book Confessions, in which he roughly recalls or remembers how he learned language as a child. That being through associations of words to objects spoken by his parents, and he eventually just got the hang of it. I claim that Augustine's picture is a picture in the most direct and aesthetic of senses. It is a landscape, a window into Augustine's capacity of philosophical formulation in his time period. A look into a painting that has inspired further philosophical thoughts, not due to its uniqueness, rather due to the almost self-evident commonality of it. Wittgenstein provides the German translation after the Latin original, thus marking his appropriation of the picture. We can speak of Wittgenstein's framing of the Augustinian picture, so far a private take-up of a private picture. Wittgenstein's own first sentence after Augustine inverts the scenario. These words, it seems to me, gives us a particular picture of the essence of human language. That's in the very first paragraph that he posts after the Augustinian picture. A particular picture of the essence of human language. In the German, in diesen Worten erhalten wir, so scheint es mir, ein bestimmtes Bild von den Wesen der menschlichen Sprache. It's a funny sentence. Particular, or bestimmtes, can be understood in two ways, in the sense of precision or exactness, and in the sense of property. Augustine's picture is not precise. It does not resemble a theory, but a memory, which leads me to believe that Wittgenstein uses it in the sense of possession. The essence of human language, in its own right, is a very loaded sentence. The word essence, Wesen, has historically connoted metaphysical inclinations. To speak of an essence is to speak of some sort of quality that makes the subject what it is in the most basic sense. The essential or necessary quality of human language is that which makes human language what it is. On one hand, what is essential to any one given thing is the most particular or unique quality about that thing. It is its most defining characteristic. On the other hand, a general essence, like that of human language, refers to the most generalized version of a supposedly determining or unique quality. A particular picture of the essence of human language refers to a unique snapshot of the most intimate and defining generalizable quality of a given thing. Wittgenstein's taking up of this picture is itself making generalizable this supposedly particular. This is an odd sentence because we know that Augustine's picture is not a unique picture at all. Or maybe it is the earliest recorder or the most well-recorded of not just how we generally think about language, but what would become the early analytic understanding of language, such as that of the author of the Tractatus. A term equals an object, says Augustine, and truth is found if such a term successfully refers to a fact in the world is the addition of the early analytics. This is further compounded by the fact that utilizing the term essence is inevitably, almost daringly, to use the language of metaphysics in which one would very much appreciate the capacity of having a particular, in this case, an exactness, quality to identify the existence of any one given thing. What is essential, to hopefully tie it back to Jan van Eyck's painting, is precisely his signature, that which marks the work as uniquely his, as what is Jan van Eyck's, as the presence or the being present of Jan van Eyck within the matter of the picture. Likewise, to speak of Augustine's picture is a framing of the picture that contains the essential quality of it within. This picture belongs to the signature of Augustine, not to some worldly truth about the nature of human language in the way that the author of the Tractatus, that opens his book with the most sweeping and generalizable declaration possible: the world is everything that is the case. That's the very first sentence of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, would want it. The essential determination is no longer the identification of an irrefutable general quality in the world, but the particular essential signature contained within the matter, as both subject and physical material of the picture. It no longer describes or reflects what is, it does something else. This something else is brought to the forefront once Wittgenstein proposes, as a contrast to the Augustinian picture, as the picture of the picture, or the function and effect of the Augustinian picture, the scenario of the apple shopkeeper. Wittgenstein proposes a scenario in which someone with a paper slip that says 5 red apples goes on to buy apples from a given shopkeeper. He gives the slip to the shopkeeper looks up the word red in a color chart, understands what the word 5 means by heart, and produces 5 red apples. Wittgenstein ends this paragraph by questioning, but what is the meaning of the word 5? And responding, no such thing was in question here, only how the word 5 is used. Only how the word 5 is used, or to shorten it, how is it used, as a question opposed to what is the same type of redirection utilized by Van Eyck's signature. It is no longer a problem of the artist, of whether the artist or God are able to produce the painting, the nature of the artwork as such, what the artwork is, as much as the problem becomes how is the painting made, by which technical advances, by whose hands, and perhaps most importantly, how should we compensate, reward, this technical progress. Wittgenstein's encapsulation of the image and subsequent turning of the question fundamentally changes the comprehension, the reading, the writing, and therefore the thinking of philosophy. This is somewhat obvious to anyone that has read the PI, but it seems important to highlight that this change occurs much earlier than the sections on private language and rule following, much earlier than Wittgenstein's philosophy of mind, or so-called philosophy of psychology, and even earlier than the first appearances of the term of language games. We could even call it, if I was a better philosopher, something like a discrete graphic intervention, not in the sense of grammar, as in words written on paper, but graphic in the sense of a production of a picture, that which can only be seen and not heard. It is only through such a change of questioning that enables the production of all things that come before it. It is, in a certain sense, not as much of a progression as it is a dismantling of the matter of pictures and putting it back together. Wittgenstein's turning of the question of what is towards how is a specific turn. It is a quasi-pragmatical turn. It is a much more actionable question as a whole. However, I would be remiss to not point out that such transformation is not necessarily to follow only to the question of how, but it can also dissolve into the more mysterious question of why. The question of how turns away from the question of what. It is either a refusal or a dismissal to answer. The question of why, and this is part of its difficulty, necessarily turns against the question of what. It is a question of value, a question of economy, in its most basic sense. Why this and not that? Why white and not black? Why the price of eggs over democratic freedom? And most insidiously of all, it hints at a question of origin. Why is what the question of highest value? As it were, what is shared between why and how is that both of them come as exemplified in pictures. The how is in the PI, and the why is also in an investigation, but in one that is ultimately attempting to go beyond the established value to ask the why of good and evil. Hence why Nietzsche opens the preface of Beyond Good and Evil with the provocative picture, suppose that truth is a woman. And given the numerous commentaries on this sentence alone, it is important to remember that what is supposed about truth, or the truth of truth, what is supposed is about truth, the truth of truth, and not about women. Even if the woman creates the metaphor, it does not become a question of woman. Yet Nietzsche continues, and here I would highlight that the following interpretation has been taught to me by Professor Babette Babbage, thus it is her signature on this particular picture and not mine. And he begins to form a basic logical syllogism, which is, supposing that truth is a woman, are there not grounds for, this is a quote, are there not grounds for suspecting that all philosophers, her suitors, insofar as they have been dogmatists, and they all have failed to understand woman, that the horrible seriousness and clumsy importunity with which they have usually paid their addresses to truth have been unskilled and unseemly methods for winning a woman. Certainly, she has never allowed herself to be won. The syllogism is formed as, suppose that truth is a woman, then philosophers are her inadequate suitors. If philosophers are truth's inadequate suitors, then philosophers cannot win over truth. Thus, if truth is a woman, philosophers cannot win over truth. Or to put it in other terms, if truth is a woman, she does not let herself be won. And then even the picture of logical syllogism, one of the foundations of formal logic, is comedically brought under attack on its capacity to support an argument that proves Nietzsche's point on its inadequacy to actually achieve what it's supposed to have, truth. Nietzsche then moves from the preface into the first aphorism of Beyond Good and Evil itself and asks, suppose we want truth, why not rather untruth? This question is not the often more cited and incorrect, there is no truth, but is supposed to strike us as strange or even ridiculous or moronic. The value of truth is self-evident, not just to philosophers as a whole, but the general population as well. Nietzsche seems to be at the peak of his dangerousness. But if the value of truth is self-evident, or questions towards it remain chained to the questions of economy, how to identify truth, own it, sign it, expose it, have it, so on and so on. that artworks are God's will and still endlessly valuable, why are they? In other terms, supposing that God is real, why am I not paid? And I'm gonna abruptly cut myself off after that, mostly because I think it would devolve into endless nonsense even with the continuation of reading, but also because I think it would just be more productive to have any feedback that maybe come out of this presentation. So, thank you.
Also, can we get like a copy of the text?
My text or
like the way you're reading from?
Yeah, but do you want like by email?
Sure.
Like now?
Whenever.
Oh. Yes, sir.
So with the 5 red apple paper slip, and Wittgenstein is like asking what the meaning of 5 is isn't the right question. Asking how it works in the situation. So it's about its meaning is equivalent to its like operative power in the situation. When you compare that to the paintings with how is it, asking how 5 operates is similar to asking how the painting was made, and that's why you brought up the signature of the artist and everything. Do you see how the painting was made being vital to how it operates? Like when somebody's interacting with the painting, when they're sitting there seeing it, is how the painting was made important to facilitating that interaction?
Yeah, I guess maybe that's the blending of Nietzsche's and Wittgenstein's questions, right? Because why is precisely part of why is also why would truth matter in that sense? So if we philosophers, I guess, we scholars, would have this notion of that understanding the painting in some sense also includes understanding the creation or the origin or what the painting is as such in some sort of really abstract way. I don't think that in order to observe the painting or interact with the painting or find significance in the painting and so on and so forth, it has to have that question, which is why the turning of how is, a quasi-pragmatical matter. But at the same time, I would also say that I do think that it is a turning away of the question. So it's not an actual refusal an actual refusal in the sense of it's a refusal to answer. It's not an actual refusal of the question in the sense that the extent of how when I can sign the painting and proclaim that the painting is his does not necessarily end the debate on the how is God related to the production of art or the truth of art as such. But I do think that it becomes of a more important sense for us as spectators. How can I appreciate it? Or is it necessary to know its origin to appreciate it? And for the artist, how can I get paid? How can I, proclaim actual art as mine?
And just to follow up to that, have you thought about including SEC into this discussion?
Yeah. So obviously there's like I'm hesitant to use Derrida very obviously, at least because I think it's a very volatile subject that I'm trying to work through. But in a very real sense, like the discussion of signatures and the discussion of the self and the other in a very broad sense would call for Derrida. But even as it currently stands, I would have to define so many terms and actually provide backing and justification for a lot of the things that I'm saying. That if it were this to become a real paper, maybe it would just be too bloated if I started talking about Derrida. Even though it's obviously, I think, at least a Derridian reading of it in some sense.
Right.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my question, just that thin little thread of like, you said the word signature, I was like, wait. But that I could almost see how in refusing to answer the what question and moving on to how and why, to me that almost is also responding to maybe something that Derrida would say, like in a sort of Yeah, but I'm not really talking about ownership in that sense, and like, because I feel like for SEC, the impression I was getting was that the signature, initially at least, was to answer the what question. What is this? It's something that I wrote, or it's something that I painted. So that the painting, him signing it, that would answer that almost metaphysical question of like, well, this is a painting by Van Eyck because his signature is there. Whereas I think if you move away from the what question and move into the how and why, his signature functions less in answering that question and more, well, the ownership of this might be in question, but how it was made was by a person named Van Eyck, which is,
Yeah.
But that was, again, I agree with you that would be maybe not too large of another addition, but that I don't think that it would maybe present actually that big of a issue if you left it out.
Okay.
But I would think that too, you're, in terms of feedback for this, you are looking to turn it more into a paper or more presentation feedback? Like, what are you, anything?
Anything.
Yeah.
I kind of like that idea though, because if the signature was initially like as a social practice meant to answer the what question, Derrida does kind of explode that and say, well, it doesn't actually do that. So just bringing him up to say that, yeah, we need to, here's another reason why we need to move away from the what question to the how question.
Yeah, I definitely
sense.
think, I think I would like to incorporate on that sense, especially because even in some other texts by Derrida, like La Différence, to mark the difference out of something. So to mark the to note that this painting is your painting as opposed to every other painting not being, it's not just that Van Eyck has his signature, but it's like one of the first artists to actually start signing it. So he produces an actual tangible difference in the painting itself that is noticeable to the point that you can actually mark out that difference. And to think about that in relation to all other artworks is to think about, what's the origin in the sense of, who produced this, which is, I think, a way of thinking about the what question in some, like, I guess, economical terms. There's maybe something there to just writing a paper on Jan van Eyck and his signature and Derrida to that extent, and not even taking up Nietzsche and Wittgenstein. But I also find that the explicit act of asking a question, even though Heidegger also talks a lot about it in Beyond Good and Evil and Philosophical Investigations, is very much connected to noticing a difference, right? Why is the Investigations written so strangely? Because it has a different question. Why is Beyond Good and Evil written so strangely, or why Nietzsche was so strange? It's because there's a different question, right? But yeah, I think I agree with you guys in general. It should be more than that.
I have a question again, similar to what Ava was saying. In asking why, so for moving beyond the mirror binary between what is towards how is, but instead looking at instead question of why, aren't we not ultimately presupposing that the what question has now not been abandoned, but merely been transferred, as she was saying, to a different target or towards a different target? For example, in asking why something is, the questioner is striving to realize a purpose that he has. He has some kind of there's some kind of discordance or some kind of instability within his intellect that he needs stabilized, essentially. He needs to find some kind of satisfaction in an answer, something that's would only give that kind of intellectual satisfaction that he's striving for. But when asking why, one is striving to realize a purpose that would be realized only insofar as the questioner finds that satisfaction or the fulfillment of his purpose in a somewhat or in something which is intellectually satisfactory, as I said, but would this not be identical to the answer of the original what question that would have that was alleged to have been set aside or passed over? So it seems like if we simply move down to the question of why and set aside any, we totally do away with the questions of what. If we do that, well, then we'd also have to do away with the relevance of the answers to those questions, it seems. Because the answers to those questions, the what questions, it would seem to be not appropriate to the why question if we solely want answers to why questions. It seems like, though, that those three things, the what, why, and how, they're inextricably linked. So if we were to be led solely down the path of why, well, we can't have another why as our answer. We have to kind of bottom out in a what to stop that, the endless questions. Because it seems like, well, why this, why this, why this? But we can't even do that, though, because it seems like we're stopped ultimately by a what, because we'd have to ask what the thing is that we're now asking why about. So essentially, my point is, it seems like those three aspects of questions, or those three forms of questions, can't be none of them can be set aside from each other. But I just want this.
Yeah, I think maybe there's two things in your comment. Well, there's maybe three. At the very end, where you're talking about, well, it has to stop at a what. I think that's also part of what fuels the final this segment of the rule following sections, where Wittgenstein claims, there is such a thing as acting in accordance to a rule, and such a thing as acting in disaccordance to the rule, and that doesn't require interpretation. Or that's not actually the full quote. There is a whole bunch of secondary literature sort of trying to understand how could that be that there is this proclamation, or if he's actually saying what we think he's saying, whatever. But I do think that I think that then to come to the second part of your question, I do think that the why and the how are shadows, in a certain sense, of the question of what. To the extent of if the question of what was completely answerable by itself, then I don't think that the Western metaphysical tradition would have reached the point that it had reached, in the sense they would have incited Nietzsche and Wittgenstein to write in the ways that they did. So, but to claim that they could have written without it is also nonsense, right? Like, to philosophize with a hammer means that you have to break something that was already there down. So Nietzsche is playing off of some of the capacity of asking what beforehand, which is why the question is so striking, right? Like, and this is maybe the third part of the question. I want to emphasize that it's not why, the psychological question why, in the sense of why do we want it, but in the sense of why this or not that, in the sense of economy. Why is this more valuable than that? And I think maybe that would be something that would have to also make more explicit within the paper itself, because otherwise it's really just asking for something that can't be answerable, right? That's why some people call Wittgenstein, the second part of the investigation, philosophy of psychology. But I think the real center of the question of why is how come have we valued things in the way that we have valued over the period of time that has existed Western philosophical metaphysics. Bryson?
I really like the concept of pictures and language and everything, and it's interesting the references you make to current events. And I'm trying to make sense of this question more broadly, but there's this sense of, to what extent are our actions or words or even art our own, even when we do sign them, right? So, it's like we talk about, for instance, the Elon Musk situation, and people say, well, there's the argument, is it a Roman salute or is it, a Heil? And it's like, there's this argument back and forth, and of course, he's going to take the position of a Roman salute. But while on the one hand, maybe he could try to say whatever his intentions were, whatever that means, to what extent does that even matter if the action that you performed has been taken up to mean something very specific? Especially then when you consider like the embeddedness of where did the Nazi regime get that salute from? Rome, right? And so then like to what extent is this project of like deconstruction or even if you look at sort of the shifting of the question from what to how to why, produce sort of a ground that lacks stability enough that potentially fosters this environment. And I also thought it was really interesting just to note that like autocratic governments really are obsessed with controlling art and stealing it. Like I think of like Hitler stealing loads of art. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think on one hand, to determine that Musk, the salute in general has this particular specific expression that we have taken it to signify something awful. I think this is actually a side effect of understanding how, because we could debate, and this is that was something I think like intentionality would come in. We could debate like what exactly it is, whether it's a Nazi salute or whether it's or it's throwing your heart out to the crowd or whatever, it's a spasm or something. But I think when you ask about the effects of that salute, which is in a sense asking about the howness of it, the quasi-pragmatical nature of it, then it's very clear because you can't do a picture that resembles that picture without being compromised in the same sort of type of attack that would come under, had you declared something like, I am doing a Nazi salute and then hitting it, So I do think that on that sense, I'm not really sure that I see that the question of how is making things more unstable. I think the question of why could make things more stable, such as why have we let this person do this? It's a very concerning question. But in the sense of understanding how to act on it, I do think that how is superior in that notion. And so far as authoritarian regimes and art, I mean, yeah, it's also again a question of value. To which extent we value art or we value the capacity of art to make us think about things like signatures, and like compensation and values and the self and the other. It's I don't want to say, but it's almost self-evident, right? Like so hence the reason why we need to constrict freedom around that notion, or to own it or possess it, which is owning or possessing truth is a very classical philosophical image, which I think it's has been part of the project of metaphysics, which was why it concerns me to a certain degree that we might acknowledge that the dangerousness of the question of how and why, but we think that the question of what has no danger, that as long as we can establish what it is clearly and confidently and just ignore all sorts of instability in it as a text against it, I think there's a real problem there too.
So do you have any just cursory thoughts on the appropriation of individuals like Nietzsche? I mean, of course, that also happened in the early 20th century, but especially now with alt-right movements. Not only Nietzsche, I mean Heidegger, of course, although he is on the right. And then even sort of how they're taking these concepts by Derrida and appropriating them. I mean, how do we make it bad?
I think on a certain sense, writings which are focused on unstable things are always more likely to result in discourse that is able to appropriate it in a violent fashion. But I do think that needs to be some sort of distinction between, this is Nietzsche's philosophy versus this is just something of a pointless justification or a justification for acts of violence. And I don't think, and I think then on that sense, the how question could be turned against me and say, well, how does it really matter if at the end of the day it incites violence? But I think it's a problem that we would think that there's something in particular about that philosophy that incites violence, and not that the will to enact violence is just so happen to be being put upon that particular philosophy. So I don't know. I think the notion of a philosopher king that is able to reign over all of the republic and able to determine the class of people according to their innermost nature or whatever is something that could be used to be extraordinarily violent. But it just so happened that it hasn't, because maybe Plato is less accessible. Maybe Nietzsche's aphorisms are more convenient to use as sort of snapshot pictures and represent violence in that way. I think it's a great question why have they continued to be appropriated, but I don't know. I would have to think about it more, I think.
Pivoting a little bit to, I guess, answering your initial question about feedback and stuff. I like how you were sort of not combining, but like using picture in a sort of dual sense of like the actual image, the painting, something that we're looking at that's still, but also the picture that writing is sort of creating as well. I'm just wondering how much you would want to like, I don't know, at the risk of being pedantic, like indicate the different, like why you're using the same word for two different things, just in terms of like the writing of the presentation, like if that's something that you've thought about, like defining them separately or just kind of going with it and using it, in the same sense.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think also in the last conference, the other thing that people disagreed is that maybe I should have called it images as opposed to pictures. But it's difficult to me because I'm not really clear what exactly the etymological difference is between pictures and images that it would require such a thing. And precisely because it seems like it's a double jointed problem, right? Like, if I write, it's a beautiful day outside, or if I paint a picture that shows a beautiful day outside, what exactly is the difference between those two? It's obviously that there is a difference in the sense that one is written and one is not written, but
but for the receiver,
and I think that also goes back to the notion of a discrete graphical intervention, which is also one of Derrida's terms, in the sense that la différence, written with an A, is supposed to be graphic in the sense that it can only be looked at because you can't hear la différence with an E and la différence with an A. So in that same way, when you're talking about pictures, and you have to wonder to yourself the extent to which we're always trading in pictures, in how we're talking, and the extent that actual pictures as paintings exist on some level, which is why I think Wittgenstein's framing is so difficult to get, because it's, for one hand, there's the term picture that he uses to talk about like this picture theory, and on the other hand, there's this sort of like broader scope of how do we talk about pictures in general? How can we see something like that? But I think that if I was giving it to an analytic committee, I would have specified it. If it was only up to me, I would have just kept it.
I think it's effective enough, at least to, I think we could all pick up that you were using both senses of the word.
Right.
But I was just curious if that had like been part of your process of like, do I want to actually specify what I mean, by picture and then picture prime is this other version of it, but at the same time it's like I think that it evokes more of what you're trying to get at if you aren't delineating, because you're
how to talk about pictures in particular and pictures in general, right? Like
I have a quick question. I'm sorry, I missed the first 5 minutes, so this may be very basic. Is the point of like Wittgenstein and I guess Derrida maybe like the point they're making about pictures, that a picture forces you into the how and why type of question as opposed to just asking what the picture is, because it is immediate in some way, or like is that the general thesis? Or?
No, yeah. So so that's a good question, because I think if there was going to be a paper, there would have to be more explanation about the transition from the Tractatus to the investigations, I think.
Okay.
But so no, I think the use of the question "what is," I think, has been broadly determined by, I think it's most explicitly shown up in Heidegger and Derrida as the primary question that has motivated Western philosophical metaphysical writing. In a certain sense, the question "what is" philosophy and determination of the presence of or the beingness of the things that are, right? So in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein proposes this notion that the world and the logical structure of the world is like that of a picture, and that's broadly known as picture theory. Like, so things match up in the same way as that of the picture. There's a whole thing about it. It would take kind of like a long time to explain it, but in the very sense, it's basic like that.
Yeah.
And in the investigations, it has broadly been considered that Wittgenstein abandons that project. And I think to a lot of extents, he's critiquing it, which is why the epigraph at the beginning. But in a lot of ways, I think he's seriously taking it up to ask, how could I have taken up the notion that a picture could have sufficient power to write that? And so there's this movement from the particular picture theory that he presents in the Tractatus towards the broader consideration of pictures as philosophical writing in the investigations.
Okay.
And then Derrida is just someone that would present also, this sort of the marking of questions of whatness, because Wittgenstein doesn't really talk about that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this picture theory, that's like connected with like logical atomism and that whole positivist sort of. Okay. And then my second question was so just sort of along the lines of Ryan, like what Ryan was saying, I think, which is like how are the why questions. It seems to me that certain why questions would need to be sort of forbidden or like not accessible if we're going to avoid asking what. So I guess I was just curious about like greater specificity as to what a proper why question would be in Wittgenstein's literature.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. In the sense of, I think it's hard to find exactly the boundaries on that point. It's,
Okay.
For one, I think writing through how and why is still broadly not accepted enough that we have no real standard for how we should go about it. We have the standard of writing a what paper, which is a thesis paper. The whole point is that you're saying what it is, what is the thing that you're claiming, and trying to defend it. But writing a why paper is much more difficult because it requires, for one, knowledge of the what, and second, sufficient knowledge to actually disrupt that in a manner that brings about some sort of like useful philosophical discourse, and it's not just a huge, why was Nietzsche thinking about apples and not oranges or whatever, which would be, what's the point of that? But so I think that I agree with you and Ryan that there is a specific framing that needs to be done on those questions. It's almost like blinders in a particular way, and that they rely on a history of what questions. But I just don't know that they have been pushed far enough to actually be able to say what it is or it isn't off limits in that way. Who raised?
I don't know. I was going to say something in
hands at
response to this. Did you have a separate question?
No, it was in response. It's Heideggerian.
Please help me
Okay.
understand.
Okay, just go. Okay, so you asked the last time. You go for it.
Okay. I was just going to say that I don't know if I can exactly answer what the difference between a what question and a why question is and how much you need to ask of one before you can start asking the other. But I do think that you have different consequences for the types of questions that you ask, and having to do with like the appropriation of knowledge. Derrida talks about how the what questions lead to an appropriation of, what is true, what is false, what is serious, what is unserious, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, what is appropriate, inappropriate, what is legal, what is illegal, so on and so forth. That when you have the voices who are both asking and answering the what questions, they get to decide all of these following determinations between truth and falsity, between serious and unserious, between appropriate and inappropriate, so on and so forth. And asking, maybe not asking the why instead of the what, pointed towards the same object or whatever, but asking why in response to the what questions maybe can help avoid some of the injustices that happen from one group of voices controlling the appropriation of the what's.
Okay, so this is like, so there's a common rhetorical trick that sort of people say, well, I'm just asking questions. So what this rhetorical trick is saying is, I don't have an extra grind. I don't have like a thesis that I'm presenting. I'm just asking questions. So am I like correct in like saying that like this is kind of a defense of that sort of basic idea? It's like, you can't just be asking questions sometimes without having like a definite.
I would very much say that it's imposing why it's saying that you always have an axe to grind. So like if you the notion is that if what is an attempt to have this sort of neutral, impersonal, atemporal notion of truth, which is perfect and available at all times, then asking why is a matter of trying to force out the notion that whatever perspective on truth would be a particular perspective, and whatever questions that you try to use to get at truth, which is why Nietzsche calls the philosophers clumsy and inadequate, they have, for lack of a better word, they have an agenda or a bias, or they have a specific perspective, which may be, and then the question isn't if it's good or bad, because it's supposed to be beyond good and evil, but the fact that you are able to establish that question as the question to be asked is, why this question? Why, what's the structure that claims that this is the correct determination to get at truth, for example? So it would, if you're saying that the why is a matter of revealing that you always have an extra right, so you can't just be asking questions, I would say yes. But if you're asking, is why a matter of just asking questions and not showing your hand in that way, I would say no. I think it's a pretty pointed way of actually writing, especially in in the United States.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess my question really centers on the fact that, asking what and trying to determine an answer to that seems to be a hard enough task. It seems like with every step we're taking, it becomes increasingly more and more difficult. By the time we get to the question of why, and I mean, to be fair, this isn't a presentation regarding Heidegger, but just the sense of how are we supposed to go ahead and try to sift through potential answers of why and make that the central question if we are all, I hate to use the jargon, but we're all already within our own thrownness, so to speak, and because of that we have our own sense of the matter, and we're carrying with us our own sort of interpretive structures, and even if you have an intention, I could completely misinterpret that intention and import that into my own sense of self. It's like, how can we've abstracted so far from the basic what question, how do we actually narrow in on the why with any regard to truth? Granted, your reference to Nietzsche with philosophers being clunky and whatnot.
Well, so I would say maybe that on that level, it depends. Yeah, so asking the question of what is hard enough as it is, I would agree with that. And I think that if you are very taken with the what question, maybe you don't even recognize it as the what question, you just recognize it as philosophy, you would be very propelled or taken with the notion that Hegel got it right, or at least got enough right that you would be willing to continue to work within that frame model for a long time. It doesn't have to be Hegel, but I would say that Hegel is probably the biggest barrier up until because historically he's also one of the last. But if so, the whole notion of why is that you wouldn't have to sort of climb this ladder, and then now you can jump into the question of why. But even at the very beginning, of course, it makes learning much harder. But it's kind of why should a paper be written in X way, not Y way? I think it's always present. I think this lateral movement towards the other questions, they don't have to be linear as much as they could be lateral in that way. It's always an opportunity to think through what are you valuing? What have you been taught to value? I cite Babbage's signature in the text because it's something that I value on the basis of on the face of it, But yeah, so I don't, and I wouldn't. It would be hard to even answer why Nietzsche, right? Like, there is an answer, but it's there's potential to the destructiveness of the question of just becoming the sort of like repetition of pointlessness of just let's not get anything done. Let's just sit around the circle and be like, well, but why this and not that? So, which is why How somehow contradicts or at least holds that a little bit, because it is a quasi-pragmatical question in the sense of action. But maybe you would need both. And I didn't even say anything about where in this essay. So that there's also that.
I guess I'll ask another question again about questions. So when you spoke of the issue of value with respect to why, the question of why that is, why itself can be understood in many different ways. You could have the reason for being, the reason for cause. You can have motivation. I mean, you can have many different things, but value does play a huge role in the asking of why, but also I think in the asking of what as well, because if I were to, in making a judgment, or in saying something is, let's say, in saying like, well, that is red, let's say, in doing so, I am singling out something from my visual field, let's say, or my scope of vision, and prioritizing it for a particular purpose. This particular, what I'm saying here and now has a value. So again, yeah, what I'm saying, it's one thing is difficult because what can function in two different ways. On the one hand, it can function as the what of somewhat, as in like the this such of Aristotle. So like everything that is, there's the fact that it is, and then there's the fact what it is. The what in that sense is not the question what, but is rather the object being interrogated by the question of what. So when I ask a question, let's say, it is always functioning along the lines of intentionality. So when I say like I am conscious of X, let's say, it seems to me that the act of questioning functions in a similar way to that of, which links the subject to that X. And the reason why I choose to ask this particular kind of question, rather than that particular kind of question, lies in the object on the other side of my, that is other than myself, that I am interrogating. So it seems to me that I have to have some idea of what that is in order to understand what the appropriate kind of question I'll be asking. Like, it doesn't seem possible if we think of like a kind of do like a transcendental argument, let's say, and what are the necessary conditions for the possibility of my asking this particular question, or any particular question. It always seems like to ask a question always seems to imply some kind of positive knowledge of what it is that's on the other side of the question. Otherwise, if I were to receive an answer, I would have no idea of how I am to gauge the adequacy of that answer. To ask a question presupposes some knowledge of what is being asked. Otherwise, I could never even single out that thing to be interrogated. If I had no idea if I was totally unconscious of, let's say, the subject of what I am interrogating, or I had no knowledge of it whatsoever, I would never be able to even direct my attention towards it, let alone specify it as that, and affirm something of it. And all of this seems to rely, I don't want to talk about essences and things like that, but it's always in light of, the asking of questions is always in light of some kind of positive knowledge that's already there. It seems like you could only frame questions and interrogate things only in light of a system of judgments or ideas and things like that. And and the questioning of those and questions are mere further articulations and determinations of that very system, and further refining of sorts. And it always seems to lie upon some kind of positive knowledge of what is, which is a question that cannot be disposed of, or cannot be ruled out, or said to be mistaken or misguided, it seems to me, or kind of like old hat, basically. You can't, I mean, those are just some remarks, but I'm curious to hear what you might, how you'd respond to that.
Yeah, I think this is a similar answer to the question that you had before, but I'm gonna frame it in a different way. Let's not think about the difference in questions as the framework of a mind or of how we come to perceive objects as a whole, but in light of historical intervention. So the questions, the alternative questions, the lateral questions, if you want to refer to them that way, are always brought up in light of the history of philosophy writing up until that point. Because the production of philosophy, as well as the production of artworks, we can think about, I could include that in the Young Van Eyck segment, that the transition from medieval to Renaissance painting, if you want to call it that, it's not like, there's, at some point someone said, oh, this is the last day of the medieval period, and now we're in the Renaissance. But in that transition, there's a noticeable difference in what we take art to be. We have this sort of like very realistic, when I say that word, it's also a bit charged, but we have
perspectives change.
Yeah. We have a very non-realist production in the medieval period, and then we have a very realistic production in the Renaissance period. And then any single one piece of artwork that is produced in those periods that conforms to that notion, it also takes up the name of what art should be, right? It's in some senses, every one of them is a normativity claim about this is what art is. And in the same way, philosophy.
I see.
So insofar as one of Plato's original questions in the Republic is something like, what is justice? What is truth? What is the good? And so on and so forth. And we have become up to like a particular historical moment where people start to think about things like questions. We have become fixated into this sort of ontological, metaphysical, if you wanted to Heidegger on the discussion person right there, the ontological and metaphysical determination of things, then the move isn't really, and even particularly I would say that if you're thinking about it in terms of perspective, is to think about these questions in the framework of a what question. How could we come, what is the whatness of whyness, in a certain way. So, and I know that there's some metaphysical language in that sense, but I think it's important to point out that it really is about reading and writing in the context of philosophical production, and not as a framework, a systematic framework to replace a previous systematic framework.
I see. Okay, yeah, that helps.
Also, if it is a problem of how do we establish the grounding to even start asking questions in the first place, I don't think you need to ask what something is to then start asking other questions about it, because it's just given to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would think in that givenness, there is a whatness that's given.
Right, that's like implicitly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would agree. Yeah, totally.
All right, guys, that was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luca.
Thank
That was good.
Is Carter next?
If you decide.